I never thought a strip of gravel could turn my entire life into a legal war, but that is exactly what happened the day I came home and saw a road carved straight through my land. No warning, no permission, just machinery and dust like my property was something they already owned. And the worst part is, at first I almost convinced myself it had to be a mistake. My name is Caleb Morgan, and I own 12 acres tucked along the edge of Hickory Ridge County, a quiet stretch of land I bought back in 2008 when everything out here still felt slow, predictable, almost forgotten, just old farm fences, dirt paths, and the kind of silence you only get when nobody thinks your land is worth arguing over. My property has a single narrow entrance that connects to the county highway, and beyond my back fence sits a larger 40-acre parcel that, for years, was just empty ground, overgrown brush, and rumors of failed deals. I never had problems, never had disputes, nothing that would make me think I needed more than a locked gate and a good fence line. It was the kind of place you buy because you want peace, not attention. That peace started to shift the year a developer came in. I did not even meet him at first, just started noticing little changes at the edge of that back parcel, survey stakes hammered into the soil like quiet warnings, then orange tape between trees, then trucks sitting idle in the morning fog like they were waiting for permission the land never gave them. The name on the sign was Ridgeview Horizon Development, and underneath it, in smaller letters, a man named Evan Calloway, future site of Rolling Crest Estates. I remember thinking, all right, they are building something back there. Maybe they will cut their own access road. Maybe they will go through the county like everyone else. That is how it is supposed to work out here. You do not just take what you need because it is convenient. I should have paid closer attention to that assumption, because assumptions are where this whole thing started to rot. It was a Monday morning when everything broke open. I left early for work like usual, sun barely up, coffee still too hot, and I remember driving past my gate thinking nothing about the land behind me. It was just another day. But when I came back that evening, the air felt different before I even saw it, like the land itself was holding something it did not want me to notice right away. Then I turned onto my driveway, and I saw it, a wide strip of crushed gravel cutting across the front edge of my field, clean, straight, deliberate, about 18 feet wide, running from the highway entrance, right through my property, straight toward that back parcel like a vein someone had drawn through my land. I actually slowed down thinking maybe I was seeing some county project, maybe some emergency work I had not been notified about, but there was no signage, no flaggers, no warning cones. Just fresh construction marks and tire tracks that did not belong there. I parked my truck right in the middle of my own driveway and walked out onto that gravel like I was stepping into someone else's decision already made for me. And I remember the sound under my boots, sharp crushed stone, compacted like it had been engineered, not improvised. It stretched farther than I could see from the road, disappearing into the trees toward the back parcel. And that is when I realized this was not random. This was intentional access. Someone had decided my land was the shortcut. I stood there for a long time just looking at it, trying to make sense of how you wake up one morning owning something, and by evening part of it has been repurposed without your consent. I called the number on the development sign with hands that were calmer than I felt, and a man picked up almost immediately. Evan Calloway. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed, like he had already had this conversation before with people who eventually gave in. I told him, very clearly, that a construction road had been built across my property without permission, and there was a pause on the line, not surprise, just calculation. Then he said, in this casual tone like he was talking about borrowing a ladder, yeah, that is just temporary access for equipment. We assumed it would not be an issue. I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because my brain could not process the word assumed being used like it carried legal weight. You assumed my land was yours to use, I said. And he responded like he was explaining something obvious to a stubborn neighbor. Our engineer thought that strip might have been an old easement or an used corridor. It is the most practical route for development. Practical, that word stuck with me. Practical like it erased ownership. I told him there is no easement. There never has been. I checked that when I bought the property, clean deed, no access rights, nothing. There was another pause. Then he shifted tone slightly, still polite but colder. Look, we are improving the area. This benefits everyone. And I remember looking at the road stretching across my field and thinking, everyone except the person who actually owns it. I told him to remove it immediately, and he said something I will never forget. Let us not make this difficult. You are sitting on land that is now part of a larger plan." That night, I did not sleep much. I just kept thinking about how easily he said it, like the land had already changed hands in his mind. The next morning, I called my attorney, a man named Harold Pike, older, careful, the kind of lawyer who does not waste words because he has seen what words cost. We pulled my deed again, even though I already knew what it said, and it said exactly what I remembered: no easements, no rights of way, nothing that would justify a road cutting through my field. Harold drafted a formal cease and desist that same day, demanding removal of the gravel road and restoration within 10 days. I felt a small sense of control returning, like maybe this was just one of those boundary disputes that gets corrected once paperwork enters the room. But paperwork did not stop what came next. Instead of pulling back, the activity increased. The first dump truck came through 2 days later, then another, then a cement mixer, then crews marking stakes deeper into my property like the road was now a given fact rather than a violation. I stood by my fence watching them pass and realized they were not treating this like a mistake. They were treating it like momentum. Harold filed for trespass and injunctive relief, and I remember sitting in that courtroom weeks later watching Evan Calloway sit calmly with his attorney, like he was waiting for the system to catch up to his version of reality. His lawyer argued implied access, saying the back parcel had no practical highway entry, that my land was the most efficient route, that denying access would cause unnecessary delays to a major housing development. I remember the judge leaning back slightly, looking over his glasses, and saying one sentence that cut straight through all of it: practical does not equal permitted. The room went quiet after that, like everyone understood the argument had just ended. The judge ordered immediate cessation of use, removal of the road within 14 days, and full restoration of the land. For a moment I thought that was the end of it, that the system had done what it was supposed to do, but what I did not understand yet was that winning on paper does not always stop people who are already in motion. And what Evan Calloway did next would force me to stop thinking like a landowner and start thinking like someone in a war I never asked for. 14 days sounds like enough time to fix something that should never have happened in the first place. But in reality, it is just enough time for people to decide whether they are going to respect the law or test how far they can bend it. And Evan Calloway made his choice almost immediately. The morning after the court order, I drove past my own gate expecting to see crews pulling up gravel, maybe survey teams marking removal points, some sign that the message had landed. Instead, I saw something worse: more trucks, more equipment, more movement than before, like the order itself had been treated as background noise. The road was still there, compacted and alive with traffic now, dump trucks rolling through my field like it was a public corridor, not private land, and every pass of those tires felt like a line being crossed again and again. Harold called me that afternoon, and I could hear the frustration even before he spoke clearly. "They are not complying," he said, and there was a pause after that where neither of us needed to say what it meant, because once you reach that point, the issue is no longer misunderstanding, it is defiance. He filed for enforcement immediately, but even legal processes have their own pace, and in that gap, the physical world kept moving like it had already made up its mind. I remember standing near my fence one evening watching a cement mixer turn slowly through my property, and I had this strange feeling that I was watching my own land get rewritten in real time, not stolen in a dramatic single moment, but overwritten slowly, pass by pass, truck by truck. That was when I decided I was done waiting. If they were going to treat my property like an open corridor, then I was going to treat my boundary like it actually meant something. I called Harold and told him I wanted physical barriers installed immediately, not symbolic ones, not polite ones, real ones. The next morning, we brought in a contractor and set heavy steel farm gates at my only legal access point, reinforced with concrete posts, industrial locks that looked more like something you would see on a military facility than a rural property. I remember the contractor looking at me a little unsure, like he was thinking this was overkill, until I told him to also trench the gravel strip right inside my boundary line, shallow but continuous, just enough to make it impossible for vehicles to cut through without stopping dead. He did not ask questions after that. The day the gate went up, I stood there longer than I expected, just looking at it, because for the first time since this started, my land looked like it had a spine again. The next morning, the trucks came like usual, but this time they did not roll through, they stopped at the gate. I watched it happen from my porch, one truck after another slowing down, then stacking behind each other like a line of confusion building in real time. One driver got out, walked up, tried the lock, then stepped back like the idea that it would not open had not fully processed yet. Within an hour, my phone rang. Evan Calloway. His voice was not calm this time. "You are blocking access to an active construction zone," he said, like he was reading from a script that assumed cooperation. I told him I was blocking trespass on private property. There was a sharp exhale on the other end. Then he said, "You are delaying an entire subdivision." And I remember pausing before I answered, because that sentence revealed everything about how he saw the situation, like my land was just a missing piece in his timeline. "No," I said, "you already did that when you built on land you do not own." He threatened legal action for damages, lost time, delays, costs stacking up every hour the gate stayed closed. But what he did not understand yet was that once the court order existed, the leverage was no longer in his hands. Harold reminded me of that later that day when he called back. "The county is not issuing further permits until legal access is resolved," he said, and that was the first real shift in momentum. Because now it was not just my refusal. It was the system refusing to continue around me. Without access, everything behind my property froze. Crews stopped pouring concrete, equipment idled, deadlines started collapsing into each other. I drove past the back edge of my land a few days later and saw something I did not expect: silence. No movement, no noise, just expensive machinery sitting still in the sun like it had been unplugged from reality. Evan tried to escalate. There was a motion for emergency relief filed, arguing irreparable harm, claiming the project would collapse without immediate access through my parcel. We went back into court, and I remember sitting there watching him try to turn urgency into entitlement, like speed could replace rights. His attorney pushed hard on the idea that my land was the only viable route, that denying it would harm not just their development, but the broader housing demand in the area. The judge listened, then looked at the filings again, and denied the motion without much hesitation. "No emergency relief," he said. "The situation is self-created." That phrase hung in the room longer than anything else. Self-created. I remember looking over at Evan at that moment, and for the first time I saw something different in his expression, not anger exactly, but the realization that the system was not going to bend just because the project was large. After that hearing, things shifted from confrontation to consequence. The county made it clear that no further approvals would move forward until legal access was resolved, and that forced Evan into a position he had been trying to avoid from the beginning. He could not use my land, but he also could not ignore the fact that his entire project depended on reaching the highway somehow. Days turned into weeks, and during that time I kept expecting another confrontation, another demand, another attempt to push through, but instead what I saw was something quieter: redesign meetings, survey crews moving to the far edge of the back parcel, engineers walking the perimeter like they were suddenly rethinking everything they had assumed. Eventually I got a letter through Harold. Evan had purchased a narrow strip of land from a neighboring owner on the far side of his parcel, not the direction he wanted, not the direction he planned, but the only legal option left. I remember reading that and feeling something I did not expect, not satisfaction exactly, more like a quiet confirmation that the system eventually forces reality back into place, even if it takes time. The cost of that decision was not small, over $90,000 just for the access strip, plus months of redesign, plus the removal of the gravel road from my property and restoration work to return the land to what it was before all this started. I walked that stretch of field one evening after everything had quieted down. No trucks, no machines, just wind moving through grass that had been flattened and slowly recovering. And I realized something that stayed with me longer than the conflict itself. The land had never really been taken. It had just been interrupted. But interruption still leaves a mark, and sometimes the mark is enough to change how you see your own boundaries forever. And I wish I could say that was the end of it, but the truth is, once you learn how quickly people can decide your land is convenient, you never really look at a fence line the same way again. It took a long time for the dust to fully settle after that, not just on the land itself, but in my head, because even when the gravel was gone and the machines stopped coming through my field, I still found myself looking at that stretch of ground like it remembered something I didn't want to remember. like the land had been forced to carry a story it never agreed to. Evan Calloway eventually finished his access road, just not through me, not the way he planned. And from what I heard through Harold and a few neighbors, the redesign alone cost him months of delays, contractors reshuffling schedules, permits being refiled, everything slowed down by a decision that started with a single assumption that my land was just the easiest path forward. The irony of it stayed with me, because it was never about the size of the land or the importance of the project. It was about the belief that convenience could override ownership if nobody pushed back hard enough. I walked my property one morning a few weeks after the final court filings were closed, the steel gate still standing at the entrance like a quiet reminder that boundaries are not just lines on paper, they are decisions you have to enforce even when it feels unnecessary at first. The grass had started to recover where the gravel road had been, but you could still see the faint compression in the soil, a long pale strip cutting through the field like a memory that refused to disappear completely. I remember stopping right in the middle of it, just standing there, thinking about how close I came to letting it slide in those first hours when I almost convinced myself it might have been a mistake. That thought bothered me more than the road itself ever did. Because mistakes get corrected quickly, but entitlement, once it shows up in someone's thinking, tends to expand if it isn't challenged. Harold called me one last time about the final settlement details, confirming Evan had paid for full restoration of the land, removal of all gravel, regrading, soil repair, the works, and he said something that stuck with me longer than the legal outcome itself. He said, "You didn't just win a case. You enforced a boundary most people would have ignored until it was too late." I didn't really know how to respond to that, because it never felt like winning. It felt like refusing to disappear in my own story. A few days later, I ran into one of the subcontractors at the diner in town, and he recognized me, hesitated for a second, then said something I didn't expect. He said most people would have just let it go, saved themselves the headache, and I remember telling him, maybe that's why it keeps happening, because too many people do let it go. He didn't argue with that. Neither did I. Over time, the project behind my land eventually moved forward, but with a completely different layout. A new access point carved from the far side of the parcel, further from the highway, more expensive, less convenient, but legal in a way that couldn't be ignored or reinterpreted. I heard later that Evan was frustrated about it for a long time, not because the project failed, but because it didn't unfold the way he had engineered it in his head, and I understand that part more than I probably should. When you plan something, you expect the world around you to adjust, but land doesn't adjust, not really. It just sits there waiting for people to respect it or collide with it. One evening I stood at my gate watching the sunset over the field, the same field that had been cut through, argued over, and eventually restored, and I thought about how strange it is that something as simple as a fence can carry so much meaning, until someone tests it. The silence out there felt different now, not peaceful exactly, but aware, like the land had learned something along with me. There's a part of me that still wonders how far it would have gone if I hadn't pushed back immediately, if I had waited, or tried to be polite, or convinced myself that temporary really meant temporary. And I think that's the part of this story I don't have a clean answer for, because legally it was straightforward, but human behavior rarely is. What I do know is that once someone treats your property like a suggestion instead of a boundary, everything after that becomes a negotiation you didn't agree to. And I've seen enough now to know that most conflicts like this don't start with bad intentions. They start with assumptions that nobody challenges early enough. So I'll leave it there with you, because I'm genuinely curious how you see it. Was this just a case of a developer pushing too far and getting stopped by the law? Or was it something more common than we like to admit? People testing boundaries until someone finally says no. Either way, I don't think I look at land the same way anymore, and I don't think Evan does either. If you made it this far, I appreciate you listening to the whole story, and I'd actually like to hear what you think. Was I right to shut it down immediately? Or should there have been more flexibility because of the bigger development behind it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe, because out here, boundaries are never just lines on a map. They're where everything starts.